Hello, my full name is Charles Henry Shattuck V. I go by Henry, and my Keystone project was called Bringing International Policy Home, Michigan's Emergency Management as Subnational, Indefinite, Temporary Occupation. And it also served as my thesis for my bachelor's master's for the political science program. And my advisor was Professor Maxwell. So you've already heard about emergency management in Michigan. The Flint water crisis, which gained national attention around 2014, was caused by an emergency manager. So in 2011, the city faced fiscal difficulties, and Republican Governor Rick Snyder declared a financial emergency. And later in November of that year, he put in place an emergency manager. In the year of 2013, ostensibly to save money, the emergency manager switched the source of water for the city and wrote and signed a contract to do so. That switchover occurred in 2014, and the city began sourcing water from the Flint River, and this was an emergency manager decision. By the end of the year, the city had issued multiple boil water advisories. There had been a Legionnaire's disease outbreak, and the local GM plant had switched its water source because the water coming from the Flint River wasn't suitable to use within its factory, let alone give to its employees. And in March of 2015, as the crisis progressed, the Flint City Council, democratically elected, voted to switch back its water source, but the emergency manager at the time overruled their decision so that the city of Flint continued to receive poison water. So what is an emergency manager? The first emergency manager in Flint was put in place in the city of Ecorse in 1986 by a judge. And emergency managers are put in place in cities which are facing fiscal distress. So they're a tool for the state government to try and alleviate financial difficulties that a local government is having. The legislature in 1990 made the position official. And in 2011, Republican Governor Rick Snyder was elected, and he passed Public Act 4, which established officially the position of an emergency manager with vast powers to make and break contracts with unions and with practically anyone, and to run the city government practically as a single person rule. There was no one he was really accountable to except the state government, which appointed him. PA 4 of 2011 was repealed by popular referendum, but a new public act was passed in 2012, which was practically identical, but constitutionally immune to public referendum to repeal. And there are two sort of cities which received emergency managers. The first were single issue ones, which suffered from a single issue of either particularly bad corruption or mismanagement of a city project. And then there were systemic issue cities, which were generally majority Black, post-industrial ones, which had lost a lot of the manufacturing, which had provided wealth for them, and which have suffered from long-term, really systemic issues, which have hurt their financial health. So previous scholars have looked at this either through the lens of public administration, sort of looking at the current effects of emergency managers, who makes a good EM, and sort of looking at the economic future. What sort of, how good are EMs at fixing the economic difficulties which impact cities, and sort of focusing primarily within that lens. Other scholars have used the framework of discriminatory policy, linking emergency management today to past histories of discrimination within the state of Michigan. And it's important to note that at one point, over half of Michigan's Black population was under emergency management, while approximately 15% of the total population was. So its implementation was very discriminatory. My approach was to look at emergency management here as a form of indefinite temporary occupation, looking to the international realm where we see, say, the Israeli occupation of Palestine or the Moroccan occupation of the Western Sahara, which are ostensibly temporary events under international law, but which have continued without end for multiple decades. So I'm trying to link not only the historic harm to what's happening today, but look at how emergency management hurts cities into the future. So I got this sort of framework by reading Robert Mickey's book, Paths Out of Dixie, which looks at the democratic South after the Reconstruction as a form of authoritarian government enacted by a subnational regional governments instead of a larger national government. So I came up with the term of subnational indefinite temporary occupation, which is in my title. And I use the acronym SITO for it because it is far simpler and quicker to say. So there's 6 main criteria of SITO. There's elite consensus. Local economic elites approve of emergency management and the suspension of local democratic rule. The second is there's constraint by the national government. So states can only do so much without going over the bounds of what they're allowed to do. It also requires both the national government and the national citizenry to either not care at all or not care enough to force change within a state. And then it also requires a sympathetic national judiciary to rule that both the public acts within Michigan are constitutional and that the actions which emergency managers take, that those are also legal and permissible. It also requires strong regional governments. In other nations throughout the world, which are far more centralized, it'd be hard to imagine a local or a regional government suspending local rule. And then also, sort of in contrast to international examples, occupation is going to occur within the borders of a regional government. You're not going to see, say, Michigan occupying a city in another state, but you're going to see Michigan occupying local governments within itself. And this sort of synthesized in a quote from my thesis, which is, from these foundational characteristics, SITO can be succinctly defined as a suspension of a local government self-rule by a regional government, which continues indefinitely. This occupation appears to be temporary in order to avoid possible interference by a superior national government. So local governments within the US aren't strongly supported. Dillon's rule, which is a sort of idea that emerged in the later 1800s, is that a state can impose or suspend local government at will. They can repeal local governments if they see fit, and that has caught on since the 1880s. And also local residents within Michigan saw emergency management as an occupation. As you can see from this sign here, people referred to it as a dictatorial sort of policy. And there are citizens within the city of Benton Harbor, which was under management, that used the analogy of the Iraqi Reconstruction to describe what their city was going through. Also, elites benefit. Corporations are able to get policies passed by the emergency manager, which they like and which benefit them, but which democratically elected leaders have refused to implement in the past. And then also, this occupation is limited as it gained national attention and prevalence. There was pressure put on the state government and Governor Rick Snyder to end the policy. Excuse me. So looking to the future, although emergency managers are ostensibly in place to improve fiscal health, they generally reduce short-term debt at the expense of increasing long-term debt, hurting the government and democratically elected governments down the road. Also, they reduce the capabilities of your local governments by firing vast amounts of workers who know how to run the government, and like in the future, a local government cannot do the things that its residents require of it, and they're forced to continue outsourcing critical jobs. Third, these governments are usually changed drastically after an emergency manager is in place. So there are city administrators who are added to local charters who are able to reduce the power of locally elected officials And finally, even though the last emergency manager was resigned in 2018, the law is still on Michigan's books and can be reemplaced at any time. And that is my presentation. Thank you.